anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-Futurism.
Listeners, welcome back to the Anglo-Futurism podcast. I'm Tomo.
And I'm Calum Drysdale.
And with us today are James Phillips and Laura Ryan. They are the co-authors of a report, A New National Purpose. Actually, sorry, I don't want to say this whole thing.
Needless to say, it's a long title.
And a long paper.
But it's about inventing a new kind of laboratory that will revolutionise British science. But I do wonder, James and Laura, reading this paper, whether it comes from a place of pain.
Certainly comes partially from a place of pain. Yes, not our pain exclusively, but I think it definitely comes from a place of disenfranchisement for young researchers, not just in the UK, but globally.
Well, we should say, what is your experience with science then? So, you've both been researchers?
Yes, we both PhDs, both neuroscientists actually, as is the other co-author of the paper. I'm not sure if we should read anything into that or not. But yeah, we both fairly recently finished our PhDs, so we have reasonably recent experience of what this sort of pipeline feels like, and obviously talked to a lot of our colleagues at the time when we were at university, and have since reached out to more and have heard some pretty consistent stories, I would say, across the spectrum. It's obviously somewhat different field to field, but...
I'm quite enjoying this because I'm currently doing a PhD. So that actually the sort of fury and frustration that I'm feeling, clearly actually once I've finished, I'll be able to turn around and say nasty things about everyone who I worked with just before while I was working.
The people that you work with are brilliant, which is the most exacerbating part of it. It's the structures that they work in that are the problem, and I think a lot of scientists feel this. It's not just the young scientists. I think this has felt right the way up the career ladder.
So, as I understand it, as a kind of word cell who's kind of never travelled academia beyond a BA, basically the smarter you are, the more encouraged you are to do a PhD. And maybe, okay, that's not true. You're already sort of wincing.
It's probably
You're already wincing.
Well, but we've got three people here doing a PhD, Tom, so actually...
I'm saying encouraged rather than ending up doing it. But you end up doing a PhD, and then your reward as you go further into academia is doing more admin and more supervision and getting further away from the actual substance of the thing that you're good at and interested in.
Well, yeah, that's if you make it to the PI, the professorial stage, then you kind of very rapidly are moved away from the bench, and you end up managing a team of people, managing resources, writing papers, having to continually generate more funding for everybody who works in your lab. But then in between that stage, there's a very long kind of protracted training period post-PhD where it's not, in my experience at least, it's not so much the insecurity or the bad pay that put off young scientists, although those are not great, and but they're sort of things that people know going into it. And so if you think that you're someone who can make it, you kind of go into it with your eyes open about that element. The part that I found that people struggle with more is seeing everybody else in their lab sort of panicking that they need to get positive results on exactly the right timeline to get a paper, which they might need for a fellowship, which has a deadline a particular time. And so that both sort of constrains the level of ambition you can have about your projects. You might well take on something a bit safer if you know that your career progression is totally predicated on getting a paper in a particular short timeline. And it can also incentivize cutting corners slightly and not so great research practices, which is totally understandable because people will panic. You've done 6 months going down a route in research and it doesn't pan out, but it's been really great, exemplary science, very replicable, interesting, creative. But if you don't get any positive results, that's just time wasted, basically, according to most of the metrics that we use to assess people. So it's that kind of element of the incentive structure of the ecosystem that I think scientists are just well, if it's not a sort of fair game or not a game that I can play in a fun and creative way, then I'm not interested in playing.
Because this does seem to be the problem, right? Is that we have a situation where researchers are individuals largely, and so you're a PhD student, you're in a lab under someone, but you're actually you still got to do a lot of your own work, right? I mean, people talk about the loneliness of a PhD, where you've got 3 or 4 years to figure something out, and then when you finish that, you go and be a postdoc. Similarly, trying to be an individual, you don't have a lot of institutional support or cover for, as you say, when things go wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, to you, because I think a lot of people, when they hear this, they'll think, well, that's science, right? You're a careerist, you've got an academic career. What's wrong with that? And for you, you say these institutions are the problem. What specifically are the forces that are driving this incentive to maybe slightly be safer, or even maybe alter the data to get what you want?
Sure, there's so many elements that I got. I guess 3 things that I might want to say. First, on the kind of loneliness and individualism, I think it's very dependent lab to lab. I had a great cohort of students and great postdocs and PI in my lab, so it was not a particularly lonely endeavor, but certainly there are blockers to pursuing sort of team science and team projects, because as you say, it is the case that each one of you is on your kind of PhD journey with your own project, and there's not much flexibility in terms of being able to drop a project and then work with somebody else, and in the kind of way that there might be in a dynamic startup or something like that. So, and then again, your sort of potential to collaborate outside your lab is entirely dependent on your PI and their say-so, because it's their research program that you're working on. So in that sense, that's definitely true. On the question of sort of what's driving this, it is just the fact that, and this is almost verbatim quoting something that I think James wrote in one of his early blogs, that the more distant a sort of bureaucracy is to what they're trying to assess, the cruder the metrics that they have to use in order to assess that. And so for assessing the quality of a scientist, what we're not actually looking at is how inventive are their ideas, and how faithfully did they pursue them, how cleverly did they design their experiments, did they carry those out in a technically proficient way. We're looking at did they get specifically positive data in the right kind of time frame, something that likely can contribute to a paper. That paper's citations will be dependent on how many other people are interested in that paper. So obviously that kind of pushes science towards popular areas of science and away from maybe neglected or funkier areas where there aren't so many people working. And that kind of opens up a whole other can of worms, which is something else I'm very interested in, and I won't waffle on about now, which is the kind of primacy of positive over negative data, that at the moment we don't collect most of the research data that scientists generate because we're only interested in something that disproves the null hypothesis rather than data that proves the null hypothesis, which is just as valuable. And that kind of primacy of positive over negative data, I think, is really distorting the way that scientists view experimenting and the scientific endeavor generally, and is a very difficult problem to solve unless you can solve the problem of publication and how we assess scientists and how we fund them.
I just sort of build on what Laura said by talking. A lot of this can sound somewhat niche, but it actually has a huge impact on the world. So just in the last few years, it became clear that some of the foundational papers of almost the entire field of Alzheimer's research were fraudulent. Now, if science works as it's advertised as working, that should have been exposed very quickly. But actually, it's in everyone's interests to piggyback on that result and put the next incremental paper out on top of it. And it took 25 years for them to actually realize that the foundational paper wasn't true. Right, so and that influences public policy. It influences where pharmaceutical companies invest billions and billions of pounds, and that's just one narrow niche. You can see similar things in brain imaging. When I was an undergrad, the group that I spent some time in, the postdocs and PhDs sort of were saying, well, we know that a lot of stuff being published is just not true. They don't have enough statistical power. Again, it took 20 years after that for that to become common knowledge, right? So the error correction systems are wrong and broken, and this stems in large part from the incentive structures within the academy as it is today. I think there's a story by Leo Szilard, I think, and this was around the time that things like peer review came into being after World War II. People forget that a lot of these systems are actually relatively recent. And he wrote a satirical story, and it was about a very wealthy person who was very worried about science progressing. And he was asked in this story, how are you going to slow down science? And he says, well, what I'll do is I'm going to fund lots of science to slow it down. And he was like, obviously people are a bit confused by this. And he says, no, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this thing called peer review. And there's going to be committees that analyze the applications from scientists. And what this will do is it will bring a lot of scientists out of doing science into administration. So that'll slow it down. And second of all, everyone will have to work on things that they know 3 of their peers will agree is a good idea, which will immediately kill off all the unusual new fresh shoots of ideas that would grow into new trees, and will just sort of work on well-known areas. And he described it as like a parlor game where people are almost looking for retweets rather than foraging into new and uncertain areas. And if you read that thing, it was written, I think, in 1948, it's amazingly prescient about the system that we have now in science. So one of the ways that I've put this before is, if we think about the Renaissance in Florence, historians will spend entire careers looking for a tiny fragment of paper in an archive to illuminate some small detail of how Michelangelo or Leonardo organized their studios. And yet we have a complete lack of interest in the conditions and organization of the equivalents today. We just sort of treat science as this black box. And what we're doing in this paper is to try and look at some of those incentives at quite a deep structural level and say, how might we change those to free scientists again? And to close, I mean, from my own experiences as a scientist, I was fortunate. Some of my bets managed to pay off when I was a PhD, and I was approached to go on a tenure track process at one of the leading US universities. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to work on this different area to the one I've done. And they sort of looked at me almost like pitifully, like, no, that's not how it works, James. You have to now do the incremental next step on your PhD work, because that's how you'll get the grant that you need. Once you've built up a few grants and you've written some papers, you can then do some ambitious stuff. Right, so it's sort of built into the system to say, wow, you've done really well in your PhD, come and join us. But you've got to carry on doing what you're doing. So the whole system just locks you into more of the same, more incrementalism, making sure you get that next step.
And I am very sympathetic to a lot of this. I'm currently involved in a feud with the health and safety officers at in my lab, because they caught me sleeping on a camp bed, which did not pass a risk assessment.
The specific camp bed, or the whole process?
The process as a whole. It turns out there's not a standard operating procedure for sleeping in the lab, and so these are administrators holding up crucial work. But the thing I want to ask is, and to slightly push back, or to sort of get at the meat of this is this not just a natural process of like institutionalization, that when you have if we want to do more science, we have to get more scientists. We can no longer rely on a few lone geniuses. Like, what is the sort of the breakdown that means that this process of getting more scientists is not like scaled more efficiently? Because like surely this is just a natural thing that happens with larger institutions.
Well, I think that it presupposes 2 things. Firstly, that there is one correct institutional structure for all different kinds of scientific project, which I don't think is true. And secondly, that the one type that we've bought very heavily into, the academic model, is the best version, which I also don't think is true. But I think the first of those is the more important, is that there are all different kinds of scientific project endeavor. Some of them are like very high risk, long time horizon kinds of efforts, and those will require very different management, very different structures, very different incentives than, for instance, like a very goal oriented effort that requires a lot of collaboration across institutions, and you need a lot of intermediary goalposts that you need to pass through. And so I think that, to me, that's always been like self-evident in the same way that it is in other sectors where there is far more institutional diversity. In R&D, the UK is more homogenous. Like, we rely more heavily on one type of institution than almost any other advanced science nation in the world, the university department model. And it's not just us that have pointed this out. It was pointed out in, I believe, the Nurse Review, right? It was pointed out by Onward. It's in a recent report from the Institute for Manufacturing that this over-indexing on this one model might end up becoming a strategic vulnerability. And beyond that, I think even if it weren't, it's evident that it's not working for a generation of young researchers. It's evident that it's not working optimally, and I think it's very unlikely that incremental tweaks to a system with so many moving parts that, as you say, has grown to such scale, are going to be able to like meaningfully course correct. And so we view the Lovelace Labs proposal primarily as a diversification, filling a niche for a kind of scientific project that struggles to happen in universities, and we can explain why perhaps in a moment. But we also hope that in showing that there are radically different ways of doing science where you sort of reject every premise and fundamentally reorganize how we promote talent, how we share resources, how we think about risk and timelines, that some elements of that can sort of be proof of concept to help drive further diversification and also reforms to the broader system.
Just before we dive into the report, I hope we can zoom out slightly and ask you the question, what would society be like if we weren't so dysfunctional about science? What would life be like right now if there were kind of no replication crisis and we had the right Alzheimer's drugs, that kind of thing? And also, what would the world be like if we were even more dysfunctional? Like, is there a country in the world that we would be, that's a kind of good yardstick for this? So we want the kind of best and worst case, really, to illustrate how important this stuff is.
Well, I mean, I think that you can look at the difference in growth rates between the US and Europe, and a large amount of that difference over the last 15 years is explained by a relatively small number of R&D intensive companies. Now, the UK has, I think, 2 out of the 100 top R&D intensive companies in the world, and our economy is stagnant. Of course, you can never quite know what it would look like if it was working better, because what it would look like is a result of research that we haven't done. But it's notable that a large amount of these advances, for example, at Google DeepMind, have not come through academia. They've come through quite a different model of research organization, and they've come through, I don't want to get in legal trouble, so I won't call them a monopoly, but let's say they're tech giants. They're not in the kind of competitive for-profit markets that other R&D private entities would. They're much more like an AT&T, Bell Labs, or a Xerox, where they essentially have large amounts of money that they just throw at problems, and only some of it has to work, and then you get the transformers, right? So I think if you want to look at the difference between the US and Europe, I think the advantage they have there is quite important.
And this is something that you try to bring into government, right? You served as an advisor during the pandemic. As I understand it, you're one of the people who helped make ARIA happen.
So I was part of a team in Number 10. We had a brilliant person, Logan Graham, who's now leading the Frontier Red team at Anthropic, and an amazing official called Zach Lawton. And throughout 2021, we sort of tried to carry on pushing that through the system. We were also trying to draw attention to things like DeepMind, but at the time, DeepMind hadn't produced AlphaFold, and so there was a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes sneering about DeepMind, saying, it's just tech bros and all this kind of stuff.
What, within Number 10?
No, within the sort of, I would say, senior academic. In fact, I've still got emails from them saying, James, you should know a lot of us don't think DeepMind is very impressive. And then a year later, AlphaFold comes out, right? So we were having those conversations in 2020 and saying, look, there's things to learn from here. It's not like you don't copy paste, but you can see there's a very different way of doing science, and we should be trying to learn from that. And in the Silicon Valley area, the philanthropists are putting a lot of money into these new kind of models. We tried to bring them to the UK, but again, the sort of senior ranks of the science establishment come very strongly from this existing model, and they're not particularly, sometimes not open-minded about new ways of doing things. And some of them are, of course, and we had some of them at our launch event.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, you mentioned some of those, right, and some of those very, very successful institutions. So, Xerox PARC, Bell Labs, the Cambridge LMB, and it is. I mean, this is rehashing some of what you've written, but I'll say it for the listeners that clearly a very small number of institutions produce most of the benefit or most of the advances in science, and yet we've got this situation where whole organizations like these universities are set up across the country that are acting often as like jobs programs, right? Where you have whole, the northern or Midlands towns their economies are being held up often by these vast flows of undergraduates. So we've clearly lost the sense of what the university is for. If we were to sort of take this model and say that Britain can take this new lab and this new way of doing science, I want to ask about the Max Planck in Germany, because clearly that is an example of a centralized organization that does amazing things, and yet it has not necessarily produced the Google DeepMind work or the Xerox PARC. What is it that you need to make these things work? If we go into the nuts and bolts, what does it take? It's not just a name, it's not just a way of doing it. You've got to have a culture there, don't you? I
think so. So actually, we suggested calling this network of labs the Lovelace Society, and that was a nod to the Max Planck and Fraunhofer societies in Germany. I think that something we go into in the paper is that the Max Planck Fraunhofer systems in Germany, along with the other societies they have, institutionalize a separation between discovery and applied research. And this is something which is quite deeply ingrained in how we think about science and technology, but it isn't there at AlphaFold. Is AlphaFold a discovery? Is it an applied tool? Is it a theoretical thing? Is it an invention? It's kind of all of these things, right? It's got new ideas, it can do real things in the real world, and it's also a basic discovery. And you can see the same thing with something like optogenetics, where you can use light to turn neurons on and off. This came out in sort of 2005. And again, the transformer, right? So there's a book by Narayanamurthy and Odamuzu called Cycles of Discovery and Invention, and it argues that institutions like Bell Labs didn't have that core division. They had them all under one roof. So you had the people building things and the people doing early stage discovery at the bench together. And so they viewed that synergy between engineering and science as absolutely fundamental. And you can see that at the origins of the Royal Society. So people like Wren, Hooke, Newton, they were building telescopes.
And the early LMB.
And the early LMB.
Nobel Prizes that came out of the early LMB, many of which were for some for fundamental discoveries, but some for techniques, methods, inventions that helped the process of science.
Precisely. I mean, you just see again and again this artificial divide isn't there in these most impactful places.
It does seem bizarre. I mean, as I'm a biologist, and just the way that a lot of biologists treat their machines is this very separation that for them that's a black box. You press 3 buttons that a postdoc has told you to press, a number comes out and you use that. Where does this come from, this divide? Because as you said, clearly organizations that don't have it have been successful. Why do we keep repeating these bad practices?
Well, isn't it that different parts of science get siloed as the frontiers get further away? Like in the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin kind of could know everything there was to know and could discover electricity. Now there is no human brain that can do anything remotely like that, considering the state of science that is today.
It's an interesting argument. I think I've heard many people make that argument. I'm not sure if I buy it or not. You mean because of all the additional complexity and just the burden of knowledge, it's very difficult to... I do see that, but I think even there are much more recent examples than that of scientists like Sidney Brenner, is one of James and my heroes, who were able to kind of every 7 years turn their hat to a different part of science. And I don't think you need the kind of incredibly in-depth understanding of a field in order to be able to, if you have the right kind of mind, assess it and bring ideas, concepts from another field to bear on that new field. So I think if we allowed more of that in science, we could have more of the kind of Renaissance scientists who were able to kind of bring knowledge from one field to the other. I think the real reason is sort of at 3 levels. Firstly, at the level of, I suppose, funding bodies and the kind of organisation of science, national organisation of science into different councils. Then you've got to level down the kind of division into different university departments and into labs that study something specific. And then within the lab, the culture is largely often set by the professor. So some professors will prefer even as simple as online lab books or paper lab books. Some professors prefer everything to still be written in a paper notebook. Some are happy with stuff being digitized. And that goes for the equipment in the lab, how up to date it is, the degree to which you might bring in a software engineer or an actual engineer in to facilitate your lab's work. That kind of culture is all largely set by the professor who runs the lab. And they tend to be, of course, somewhat older, often somewhat more conservative, though of course not always. So I think those sort of 3 levels make it very difficult for instance, a young scientist could not start to reverse this trend on their own.
Well, I mean, there's a great point that you make about just how young a lot of these people in these top institutions have been, right? That actually these are not people with decades and decades of experience. Was it that at Bell Labs, no researcher was older than 30?
It was the Xerox PARC, right? He said it to James, right? You asked him this question, Alan Kay.
Yeah, I mean, he told this to me. I had invited him to give Alan Kay was one of the pioneers of personal computing. He got the Turing Award and was cited by Steve Jobs and Bill Gates as like one of the key people behind the actual invention at the early stages in the 70s. And a senior professor at the institute asked, you're not talking about all the top-down direction and how important it is to have senior people. And then Alan gave a kind of diplomatic reply. So I stuck my hand up and said, Alan, would you mind saying how old the researchers were at Xerox PARC? And he said, I was the oldest person at Xerox PARC. I was 30.
Chop, chop, Calum.
Sidney Brenner talks about this as well. He talks about the virtues of inexperience over inexperience, and that they're not.
So it's not just mental horsepower; it's also just like an attitude to the world.
A bit of both. Yeah, he says that these are they're both virtues, but they're different virtues, and that we massively over-index on experience and credentialism and track record, and we undervalue creativity and promise and risk appetite and originality.
You see this since we were saying this in the recent years. You've seen the 3 current leading AI labs in the US. I mean, who knows how long that position will last, but you have Google DeepMind, Anthropic, and OpenAI. I don't think there was anyone over the age of 40 on those founding teams. So Dario, Jack Clark, you've got Demis, Shane Legg, Sam Altman, like these people were in their 30s. And in the UK, they would still be postdocs working as basically research assistants to professors. So it's a fundamentally different culture. During the pandemic, the rapid testing program was really seeded by 2 people, Gergo Bonner and Gaurav Venkataraman, who did a modeling paper for us in number 10 in April 2020 and said, basically, your national testing strategy is woefully inadequate. You need this rapid testing approach too. And you could greatly reduce R using this. Here's the data, here's the model. And we tried to get them an honour for that, because they were so helpful throughout it. And the science establishment blocked those honours and instead gave it to some of the people who had been blocking the rapid testing programme. So some of the people who got the honours for this programme were actually some of the key blockers, whilst the reason they get it is because they are in the senior positions. So it's almost like being a senior member of the honoured classes is a criteria itself for getting more honours at this point.
Well, I mean, it's a sort of natural thing that happens in institutions, right? Because people want to feel that they've got a safe career. Like, it's, if you do your time, you should deserve the gong at the end of it, right? But fundamentally, this is at odds with how effective organizations work. And I'll go back to earlier slightly what I said before. Is this not, like, this is a natural process that happens in institutions, right? That, the Sanger, for example, now in Cambridge was very, very exciting, very impressive, and now is maybe slightly less dynamic. I've got friends there. I'm sure they're doing very exciting work, but it's not at the cutting edge in the way that it once was. Like, how do you do this? Do you just have to destroy everything every 10 years?
Well, at least you have to compete with them. You have to allow competition. I think what you're saying is true, and I think it's certainly not just true in R&D. I think it's true of just institutions generally, is that they do tend to increase in size, increase in complexity, reduce dynamism, which is why it's important that you have the ability to create new institutions, and that if they outcompete the old institutions, that can become the new paradigm, or that people can move across. A level of creative destruction is necessary for a healthy ecosystem. And I think the main problem that we have in the UK at the moment is that if it were the case that we could just go and sort of found these sorts of scientific institutions, fund them, philanthropically build them, then perhaps we would have been pursuing that. But there are all sorts of reasons why in the United Kingdom it's very hard to compete with the university sector without a kind of project on the scale of the one that we're proposing.
James, you're a man who's been red-pilled on the bureaucratic morass that is the university sector and the pretty dispiriting state of science here and elsewhere. I wonder if you were just itching to collar Boris Johnson about this when you were in number 10.
Well, for the first year, obviously, we had the pandemic to deal with.
You were a little busy, sure.
We were a little busy. We obviously drove a lot of things forward as much as we could. And after that, I think things became quite challenging because some of the main supporters of science inside the centre of government had left. So we were really kind of holding ground as much as we could. After I left number 10, I did some analysis with Paul Nightingale from Sussex, a professor at SPRU there, which is one of the main sort of research analysis hubs in the UK. And we showed that if you look at the metrics the government uses to describe the UK as world leading, they're essentially looking at like the mass bulk of science. But if you use metrics that are a lot more selective, you see that the UK's position is about a third of what it claims. So it claims that we're present on about 13% of top research papers around the world. First of all, a lot of those is where you have like one author who's done like a PhD placement for 3 months in a lab in America, and then they've come back, and then that shows up. I was an example of that, by the way. My work was mostly done in the United States. And second of all, the numbers, if you look at like the top 100 papers, the UK is only there about 3, 4, 5% of the time. And those papers in the sample we used were from DeepMind and the Cambridge LMB, overwhelmingly. And this was even true of the UK-based analysis. So we went to some other people who said, here's the most important results over the last 10 years in synthetic biology. The UK was only there once out of 30. Right, so this sort of analysis I try to get going in government, but people just really don't want to hear it. They're much happier to describe themselves as world leading. This is a world leading strategy with all our world leading infrastructure and world leading people. And at some point, it's not a popular thing to say what we're world leading in is calling ourselves world leading. Now, that's not to say that we're like a complete backwater. We're still, I think, top in Europe. But as I've said before, and I know others have said, I think Paul Nurse in more diplomatic language said in his report, we're getting very complacent and we've become good at being the leader in Europe. And we're not benchmarking ourselves against the US, and arguably even more important, not benchmarking ourselves against China. As I've seen in the last 5 years, the number of papers in the very top science journals from China has just gone through the roof.
I think all top 10 of or at least 9 out of the top 10 institutions are now Chinese. As 5 years ago, it was, I think, 2, something like that.
It's really stunning, actually, how in the last 10 years, how dramatically it's changed.
Well, the claim is always that the Chinese work is not original, but perhaps this is becoming less of an issue now.
It's not true.
I think it's possibly true of further down the quality spectrum, but in these ones that we're talking about, no, not true.
So what's the work being done at Chinese universities that you think is genuinely world leading?
So I've seen quite a number of top connectomics papers come out, which is just beyond anything the UK. Connectomics. Sorry, I'm being a nerd.
Imagine that I don't know what that
so
means.
essentially, so this is an area of neuroscience that I was involved with. The institute I was at in America was very focused on this, which is essentially you've got in your brain 100 billion or so neurons. And each of those talks to somewhere between 10 and 10,000 other neurons. And what you want to say is, can you basically produce the kind of railway map of your brain at the cellular level? And that kind of work was taking off over the last 10 years, and I'm now seeing China's work surpassing the UK in that, as well as a lot of other work that I would have been involved with. My naive assessment is they're probably ahead of us on neuroscience now.
I mean, it's a sort of, as you say, as we've all said, there's a complacency about China, right? That they copy, this is their shadow labs, they're just nicking ideas. But clearly there is evidence that they've been able to go from behind to the frontier. So this is possible. Are they a model? Are they a model to copy? Or how have they done it?
Well, first of all, there needs to be a lot more attention on what China is doing and what it says. Even when I was in number 10, it was actually surprisingly hard to find that out. Like, hey, can I please get a translation of this Chinese thing? It's actually quite difficult. Second of all, I think this has been like a recurrent problem in Western thinking. For example, the anti-ship ballistic missiles that came online in 2008 to 2010. So far as we know, as far as I know, that's a capability the US and the UK doesn't have. So they've invented the ability to use ballistic missiles to track and sink aircraft carriers. And
just as we were building 2 aircraft
just
carriers.
as we were building 2 aircraft carriers. Because the Chinese, they just copy, we didn't have that, it can't be a problem. And then obviously there's sort of an internal panic around 2010, 2012 when the US realized, hang on, our battle plan of putting carriers into the Taiwan Strait is not going to fly anymore. And I think that kind of surprise is now happening in more basic science. I think they're still quite dependent on universities. And something maybe we'll get to is we were pioneering these different models like the Royal Society, LMB, and so on. Perhaps we're not going to be able to beat them on scale. We're not going to be able to beat them on top-down industrial strategy. And we're not going to be able to beat the United States on capital. What can we do is return to our role as kind of an innovator in the structures themselves. Yeah. And that's really what this report is getting into.
I think the one other thing I would say on China is, as James said, I think there are a lot of structural foundations that are so different that we can't really use them as a model. But one way in which I think we should be learning from them is what their response to the sort of exodus of American scientists and the fact that America has become much less attractive as a destination for global scientific talent. The packages that the Chinese were offering to researchers to come there were very much like what we're proposing in this paper, and were much more attractive. They were proposing, come over, we will give you your own lab, we will give you very strong core facilities, you can hire the team that you want to do the research you want, as opposed to, I think we were very much relying on, but we have these prestigious institutions, surely people will want to come so that they can be a professor in Oxford or a professor in Cambridge, which I'm not sure is the case.
And how much, I mean, as you say, there seems to be actually fairly little in the way of strategy in these things, that it seems to be it's been government policy basically that science is something that eggheads do, and they don't need to have a view, right? That the industrial strategy or scientific strategy is just not something really that government does. Whilst it seems that China has been very successful in doing it, why do we not have this series of like national labs in the same way? I think it's like, you know, the US has all its Department of Energy labs, and Germany has the Max Planck or whatever. Like, why do we not have this?
There's a historical reason for that, right? I mean, wasn't it Thatcher that shut down the national labs?
Yeah, there was a big constriction on things outside universities in the 80s. Under the R&D cuts. I think this question of like how involved government should be in R&D is a difficult one, because there's obviously this danger that, and I had to sort of battle this when I was in government, that, you know, a minister reads something in the Beano in the morning, and that means suddenly they're going to go off and fund some pet project. And that really happens.
Hyper-powered pea shooters.
Yeah, or that would be a relatively sensible one compared to some of the things I saw. So that's definitely a danger, and definitely a danger of like constant chopping and changing. But the flip side, so we showed up to Downing Street and we were like, okay, we've been talking to all these scientists behind closed doors. We've been hearing what they really think, and let's enact the plan based on what they want, but what they're not really saying publicly. And we go in and we start talking to the very heads of the institutions, and the people who had risen to the top of the institutions, and I failed to foresee this, obviously for them the system's working absolutely great because they're at the tops of the institutions. So the people who hold the power inside the scientific establishment don't want change. It's the people who are in the lab doing science day by day, who have stayed at the coalface, who want the reform. But the others are quite happy with the way things work because, again, by definition, it's working for them. So the danger of not having a government that provides input into science strategy is essentially you just reflect the vested interests of the people who have climbed up the bureaucracy within science. And so there's a big tension there, right, between you don't want to meddle, but you also can't just leave it to them to allocate to themselves. And my approach to solving that is just to have more types of institutions with sunset clauses, deliberate hiring policies to get different networks in, that sort of thing.
This is basically peasants' revolt of science. You're saying like down with the old hierarchies. Let us do it.
Well, there's a wonderful book called The Pentagon Wars about Colonel Boyd, the fighter pilot, who basically was fed up with the Pentagon in the 1960s and 70s, building planes they didn't need, serving the interests of these senior people. So he was the best fighter pilot ace of all time in the US training school. And he and some others went in and basically took over part of the Pentagon to try and fix it. So this was kind of a role model for us when we were going in. We were sort of learning from the Pentagon Wars. And if you read that book, it's the best account I've ever heard of what it's like to go into a bureaucracy that doesn't want to change anything. I really recommend it.
Just like quickly pick up on something that James said, which is that I think I wholeheartedly agree that the place that the UK can lead here is in institutional design and reform. He mentioned that the US has far more diversity in terms of their own institutions than we do, and that is largely as a result of large tech companies and philanthropists investing in this kind of thing. And we make the case in the report that in the UK, as a result of not having that kind of level of philanthropy or those sorts of giant companies, the government is much better placed to take up that kind of role of investing in very long time horizon, high-risk research. And in many senses, the UK government has already been a leader in this space globally. We have ARIA, they created the DCIT Metascience unit. And so I think the Lovelace Labs proposal is a particular kind of new institution that we think is necessary for the UK and could become a sort of engine of economic growth. But it's definitely not the only way in which I think we need to diversify our science system and how the UK government could innovate in the space of institutional design, including things like how we share scientific information.
Well, because I mean, it's the risk that we're already falling behind, right? That already we've got, Sam Rodriguez and the like focused research organizations in the US.
As the queen of meta-science in this country, what else should we be doing?
Well, I mean, just to pick up on something you said there, like we haven't really discussed AI at all, but universities are not going to be the institutions that are at the frontier of AI-enabled science. Like a lot of university labs are struggling to implement technologies from the 2010s that we have to streamline their lab systems. A lot of the most exciting AI-enabled science in the world is happening, as you say, in labs in the US, in ARC Institute, Future House. And if we want to, again, this is an area of AI where the UK would be fairly well placed to lead as well. We have incredible scientific institutions. We have, in an academic sense, we have great talent. we're probably not going to be able to compete in other very important areas of frontier AI. But the idea that AI for science could even plausibly be something that we could be world leading in is entirely dependent on us having the kinds of institutions that are actually able to play around with adopting these new technologies, new infrastructure, and all of that is not something that's going to be pushed by the academic sector.
I wonder also whether it's a bit of a race against time, because at the moment we do have scientific talent here, but presumably the longer the stagnation goes on, the more likely people are to just emigrate, and the less attractive we will be as a country with a university sector. So I fear that if we don't sort it soon, then we're going to forfeit our place at the back of the front.
Yeah, I mean, you're starting to see that already. There is a crisis in hiring postdocs emerging, which is a fairly novel development and like a very, very bad sign for the health of the university industry. So yeah, I think we absolutely will see that.
But your proposal would, of course, do away with all these problems because, in a nutshell, you're saying create new academic institutions that are totally free of the constraints of universities, give them money for 15 years, give them kind of empowered directors who can do whatever they want in service of big scientific missions, and they can, I suppose, hire and fire as they wish with big budgets. Is that roughly the kind of nutshell version of the proposal?
Yeah, I mean, that's in many senses that covers it, yeah. A critical element being what James started us off on, which is the rejection of this distinction between applied and basic research. So a far greater mix of engineers alongside theorists, software engineers, high-quality technicians, very, very strong core facilities such that you don't need large teams to do science. You can rely on shared equipment, and so you have much smaller, more dynamic teams that operate more akin to like a startup sort of model rather than an entrenched steep hierarchy. A lot of that would come from empowerment of young researchers. I've had a few people ask me when I've been discussing this proposal, but what would possibly make a young researcher want to work in a Lovelace lab rather than a sort of prestigious institution like Oxford or Cambridge. And I've had to felt almost kind of bad, like killing a puppy or something, telling them like no one wants to stay in Oxford and Cambridge at the moment. I had, in the response to this paper coming out, I had a couple of messages from people who I've known for a long time from science, and they were both very touching and very sad in the sense that a lot of them were from people who I always thought would become a professor. So, like one of them, smartest girl I've ever known, I think, and she was so committed to being a scientist. It's all she'd sort of ever wanted to do, and she did her PhD at Cambridge at the same time as me, and I found out that she'd also left because there was no way that she was buying into this sort of unfair potentially 7 to 10 year training period with all of the problems that we've previously discussed, but that this kind of an institute is exactly the kind of place where you can focus on your science, where the sort of shape of your research is not dictated by short-term timelines or by where you think other scientists are going to cite you.
If I think about when I was a neuroscientist, my sort of cohort, if you like, or a year or two below me and a year or two above, and I think about who I thought were going to be the stars and who were doing amazing work, one of whom's work was featured in the New York Times. All but one of those people has now left academic research. And some of them have gone to these new philanthropic organizations outside of academia. I said to one of them who hasn't left, I said, why don't you come to the UK? And they would just sort of looked at me and smiled like, to do what? Well, what's the offer? Why should I come? This person did their PhD partly in the UK. But sort of the senior scientific establishment just isn't, I think, being honest about this problem with the policymakers. That the tactic is kind of, look at us, we're great, everything's wonderful, give us more money. I don't think that's been a winning strategy for them.
I also fairly frequently hear, but surely the best ones will stay because they know that it'll work out for them. Whereas in my experience, it's often the exact opposite, which is that anyone who has alternative options, who's not willing to, particularly people who are very committed to the ideals of science and the ideals of being a scientist, they leave. And it's often people who aren't so fazed by the kinds of misaligned incentives that we're discussing or perhaps have fewer options that stay. So it's not at all the case that this is sort of a cry of rage from the failed scientists who couldn't make it to become PIs.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of this stuff myself as well, that people becoming very, very disenchanted with the story that they're told, right? Because you have serious civilizational motives for going into it, and yet the reality of the scientist is applying for bits of money and basically lying about the work that you're going to do, right? Because the grant writing process is largely an exercise in fiction where you declare, oh, I'm going to do all these things.
Yeah, and success rates are dropping, so scientists are spending more and more time writing grant applications, most of which won't be successful. So you might have some of the smartest people in the United Kingdom who could be delivering great civilizational value are spending maybe 3 times more time than they should just writing applications with slightly different criteria that go to different groups, most of which will be rejected. And then we employ somebody else to have to read those and go through them. I know there are other efforts from the meta-science field and from people within government to try and streamline that process. But the alternative is to do away with the process altogether and believe in some of our top scientists and core fund them.
Well, let's talk about then what your model is, right? Like, what have you taken from these successful institutions that would allow people to actually do the science that they would want to do, that could lead to the discoveries and the improvements that we would like to see science making?
Sure. So we group our main sort of findings into 3. I'll actually start with the second. Ones that we've already discussed are this rejection of the applied basic distinction and strong kind of technical core facilities. Of those 3, we have protection from external pressures, so that's core funding of the institutes. All 3 of the institutes that we looked at were, so core funding is a lump of money is given to the institute, and that institute can then decide how to distribute it internally as they see fit. So the researchers don't apply for grant applications. Sort of hand in hand with that principle is internal review. So as a result of not having to apply for grant applications, they don't have to write papers. Not necessarily a prohibition on writing papers, but it's certainly not the kind of end goal of a scientific project. It's not necessary. And they can be assessed by people who are much closer to the work and are familiar with the work that it is that they're doing. So colleagues can give their researchers the gift of like a couple of years if you think they're working on something exceptionally promising, but it's not the kind of thing that you can sort of prove every 6 months with a new result or finding. You can just trust that person and let them go. We had some great quotes on this in the report, didn't we? There was one from Higgs about whether or not he would have been able to do the kind of research that he did post Higgs particle in the current environment. And there was one. What was the other? Well,
there was quite a lot. I think one of them that's always stood out was Sanger. The point that Brenner made about Sanger, that Sanger won 2 Nobel Prizes. The first interesting feature about Sanger is he did the second Nobel Prize work with his own hands. So he wasn't like these current professors who essentially don't do research themselves anymore. They sort of have armies of postdocs. He was actually doing the second Nobel Prize work with his own hands. And second of all, across a 20-year period, across the major papers, published 3 papers in 20 years, and 2 of those papers got the Nobel Prize. So you'd never survive in academia doing this now. You have to publish every other year. You have to be always the result has to work. It's always very suspicious, by the way, how people's entire publication records, always their experiments worked. Obviously, it's because they don't publish the ones that didn't. And we go through the paper many different examples of this kind of phenomenon of how science has changed in a way that I think you can explain a lot of the current issues based on. And what we argue is that if you look at these sort of exemplar labs, they point you to quite a different set of structural features. Most important, arguably, is that the scientists do science.
Something that I find really interesting about your paper is the faith in the taste of for instance, the people who run these institutions. And it seems that this is a problem across various parts of government and society, that we don't trust taste anymore. And that's possibly for good reasons, because if you leave decision making in the hands of very powerful people, then corruption might emerge as a result.
D-cell.
But this is not your view, is it? You have an optimistic view that someone at the centre of an institution can actually make decisions about who to back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think this is like a much broader sort of set of principles and conversation than just exists in science. I think this is like true of government. Yeah. I think that we have like a particular model of accountability that we've kind of settled on as like the model of accountability, and the way that works is like maximum legibility, maximum transparency, and kind of distributed responsibility. And that is a model of accountability, but it's not the only model. And I think it's the model that we've fully bought into like across our national institutions. But there are other models like to trust somebody with a high degree of agency, the necessary precondition being that you can remove them or that they suffer the consequences for bad decisions, whether that be if it's a good faith bet that doesn't work out, obviously a very different set of consequences than if it's misconduct, something like that. But I think we're also not really able, for various different reasons, to engage in that kind of, to call it creative destruction is not quite right, but I think it's difficult to get rid of people, it's difficult to get rid of projects, difficult to get rid of institutions, and that being the case, we need a lot more evidence that something is going to work out before we embark on it than we would do if the system was more dynamic, and if we were able to say, we're taking a bet on this person, if this doesn't work out, then we try somebody else, or then they... there's some sort of recompense for that decision. I suppose in our particular proposal, it's a little more complicated than that, because the visions that we're proposing, you can't endow an entire institute for 15 years and then say, well, shame that one didn't work out. It's a much bigger sort of capital investment. But there are ways of identifying people who have a track record of making good bets and having made good bets in the past. And there are organizations that have operated in this manner very successfully. And I think it's also useful to think about what we mean by failure in this context. And it may be the case that a Lovelace Lab, whatever the kind of founding vision of the lab is, doesn't quite come to fruition. The like large-scale kind of thesis statement proves not to be true, or is somewhat modified from how it originally was. But the question is the bulk of the science that was done over the course of that period of time better or worse, I suppose, than your average academic lab? And I would bet a lot of money on it being significantly better. So, for instance, if we think of the LMB was originally founded with a kind of visionary mission statement. And now it isn't so much that it's pioneering a new field in the way that it was when it was originally founded, but because it still has these similar structural principles, it's still one of our standout best institutions. So you can sort of buy into quite a few of the elements of our structural model without so much needing to think that the visionary element is like critical in this being a sound investment, as opposed to investing more money into, for instance, the traditional university department.
Maybe this is defeating the point to ask, and it is just a matter of instinct, but what are the tells of someone who would be a good director of a Lovelace Lab?
I was asked by one of the magazines in the progress space to write a piece on the importance of taste, because it's something that, as you said, comes up again and again and again. It comes from a combination of recommendations from people and from talking at length with them. I don't think it's the sort of thing you can capture in a list of bullet points. It really has to be, you have to look at the person as a whole. I think in talent, under the book by Tyler Cohen goes into some of this. But this is one of the challenges with these kinds of people. If you take, say, Licklider, who was the program director of the PARC program, he essentially said, he looked for people who shared the vision and had interesting variations on it, and then he would pick a successor who would do the same thing. So it was almost like a lineage through evolution, where one director, then there's another one who sort of follows it on with variation, and it's passed down over time. Actually, that's how the Royal Society succession is still done to this day. There's no election. It's almost like a not quite hereditary system, but it's the baton is passed down, and that maintains the culture over time.
But people are very much at the heart of our proposal, and without the right people, the structural features will not be sufficient. There's a great Max Perutz quote where he says, nobody looks, not to bring it back to Renaissance Florence again, but nobody looks at Renaissance Florence and thinks, what are the structural enablers that allowed this kind of interdisciplinary work to emerge at that time? They think about the individuals that were pushing the Renaissance at the time. They think about the painters, the sculptors. And so he says, it's not possible to legislate great science into existence. The fact that we've hit upon these structural features doesn't mean that if we build these labs, we will just automatically get groundbreaking science from them. But what you can do is legislate to kill that kind of science if you have the wrong structural features, and if you cut these shoots off before they have the ability to mature. And so what we're trying to do with this proposal is to carve out a part of the ecosystem that is fertile ground for the right people with the right ideas to bring those ideas to fruition.
Who do you think are the most impressive scientists or technologists in this country along those lines? Who really impresses you?
Obviously Demis, and by the way, it's not. People say, "Oh, look, it's AlphaFold's happened. DeepMind's so impressive," but a lot of the networks of people like Matt Clifford, Mark Warner, Dom Cummings as well, were sort of aware and chatting about Demis back in 2013, 2014. So it is possible to be ahead of the curve on this kind of thing. I think Rob Miller at the Whittle Lab and the Bennett Innovation Lab is very impressive. Jason Chin at the LMB again has a lot of these things. I don't know if it'll work, but maybe I could just read the Max Prutz quote out because it really captures this. So Max Prutz was the first director of the Cambridge LMB, and this is a comment from his obituary in The Guardian. He says, impishly, whenever Max Prutz was asked whether there are simple guidelines about which to organise research that it will be highly creative, he would say, no politics, no committees, no reports, no referees, no interviews, just gifted, highly motivated people picked by a few people of good judgment. Certainly not the way research is usually run in our fuzzy democracy, but from a man of great gifts and of extremely good judgment, such a reply is not elitist. It is simply to be expected, for Max Prutz had practiced it and shown that this recipe is right for those who, in science, want to beat the world by getting the best in the world to beat a path to their door, end quote. And so one of the LMB had certain sort of internal features that sort of help to keep that culture going, which we go into in the report. So you could never have one person running a very large empire. It was deliberately very small. Each team was very small. It's grown a bit recently, but it's still much smaller than a typical academic department lab. And it was all done internally, as Laura highlighted early on, which again allowed you to be free from that external culture of committees, reports, peer reviews, and function much more like a community, like a studio in Renaissance Florence.
I think it was Rona on Licklider, right, who said that like he was a kind of strange guy who would just kind of hang around on the periphery. Nobody really knew what he was doing, and then 3 years later he came back with the internet.
Yeah.
No. What you do?
Yeah, I'm doing my best. I wanted to ask about you mentioned there Matt Clifford, right? And the work, I think, that he did with Sovereign AI Unit has been very successful in some ways. Things like OpenBind were very exciting. Now he's gone, and there is a fear that these like forces, the forces that be, the entropic forces of decay, that it's moved out of like number 10 and it's now sitting under DSIT, that very quickly the good things get squashed. Taste is very scarce, and like people don't go and do these things for a long time, right? At the moment, Matt Clifford left the Sovereign AI Unit. Do we just need to pay these people more? Like Claude Shannon. You say in your blog about
this question was funded by Matt Clifford.
Yeah, that's true. I know. Yeah. Please come on our podcast. But he. Claude Shannon, remained member of technical staff the whole time that he was at Bell Labs. Like, clearly now there is a need. People seem to want more, right? There are opportunities for the returns to intelligence are so much larger that it's harder to get very clever people to come and work at basically like difficult, painful, often public jobs for a long time. Like, how do we get these people with high taste that everyone is competing for to come and do this stuff with us?
I think part of this is just like a question of critical mass. Like, I think it's very demoralizing and lonely trying to do that on your own, right? And possibly actually pointless, like trying to do it. You'll be very limited in how much you can get done. And so I think you need a conspiracy. And once you have gradually built up the kind of numbers and you have both the moral support and the kind of actual weight that you can start getting some returns to your investment of time and effort, that's when I think you'll start to see like the balance tipping in terms of people like wanting to come in. Because that wasn't a take on Matt Clifford. I have no idea how he felt in his role, but he brought in some phenomenal people when he was in running Sovereign AI, like academics, PhD students that I know from Cambridge who were involved in OpenBind as a result of him, picking people with great taste and
who are now leaving.
But we're in a much better place, I think, than we were. James and I have discussed this a little, than we were like 5 years ago, say, in terms of the number of people. I certainly wouldn't have been able to do half the stuff I've done without significant help from various more senior people who are sort of supportive of this agenda, many of whom weren't there 5 years ago. So I think things are moving. The conspiracy is growing. Whether or not it's got to the point where we can make any meaningful things happen. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think that I don't know. I won't comment on any specific cases, but I think that if you look at the kind of misfits experiment that I was a part of,
this is the Dominic Cummings misfits and
weirdos
weirdos.
and misfits. Yeah. So I was one of the weirdos and misfits.
I was going to say which one?
both.
Which
He's
one? Were you?
both.
Yeah.
I aspire to be both. You can judge if I'm doing it.
There was a tale in TBI that everybody knew who James was because he came in on his first day with 2 left shoes on.
Sounds like a weirdo to me, to be honest.
I didn't know, surely it was a shoe that didn't fit. Then
Misfit.
Well, that whole, as soon as certain key supporters left the system, that team began leaving, and it's not just our team. I think the vaccines task force was quickly shut down and crushed. The data science unit was repeatedly trying to be shut down. Some heroes in Number 10 recently have been protecting it. It's the same with some other people who were brought in externally on science and tech roles. The system kind of ejects them. And yeah, you've used the example of Matt Clifford. I think you'd say Labour did a great job in bringing in Matt Clifford, Poppy Gustafson and Patrick Vallance to key roles, but 2 of those have left now within a year. And if you think, how did Matt first get involved in sort of a central government role? He was appointed the chair of ARIA. We appointed him. And that was because we gave him freedom. We gave him autonomy. We said, we're not going to mess around. It's entirely up to you. You've got a blank slate to do this as you like. You're not going to have a minister telling you every 5 minutes what they've read in the Beano. And that was extremely unusual. And that's not how things are usually done. So I think that the critical mass point that Laura makes is important, but it's also important people understand that the current culture in Westminster is still quite hostile.
Well, having broken the first rule of conspiracy, which is don't talk about the conspiracy, I think we will go for a break, but we will be back to talk about the mission that these labs might undertake after a brief word from our sponsors.